Hey everyone, this video is designed to be a demonstration of how you get from one state to another using transitions inside of Fmod. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to actually launch Fmod Studio. Once I've launched Fmod Studio, I'm going to save my project to my desktop so I know where it is. I'm just going to call it Fmod Transition Project. I'm going to create a new event by right-clicking in the Events tab. I'm going to need ultimately 3 tracks, so I'm going to right-click on these tracks and get 2 more tracks. I have 2 different states. One's called Explore, and the other one we'll call Battle. Then I have another track, and that track is where I'll put my transitions. Okay, so save my project. Then I go over here to my desktop, and you can see that it's saved actually a new folder called Fmod Transition Project. I put my transition materials in a separate folder. I'm going to drag those in now. Section 1 and Section 2 corresponds to Explore and Battle. And then I need 2 transitions. Transition 1 to get me from Explore to Battle, then another one to get me back again. Whenever I copy something into Fmod, it actually is putting it in its own folder. It's copying it directly into the project folder so that if I need to move it from one computer to another, it's going to have all the assets embedded right in that project folder for me. So I don't have to really worry about asset management and linking of files because it's doing that automatically for me. Okay, so I have section 1 here, and the first thing I want to do is I just want to listen to section 1. This is what it sounds like. And that's working pretty well except for 2 things. One, I want to put a little fade in at the beginning of it. Yours might not need a fade in. Mine definitely needs a little bit of a fade in. Okay, so that is working now. Now what I want to do is I actually want to loop this section. I kind of want to ignore the timeline because mostly I want to be able to go back and forth between section 1 and section 2 using a transition. The timeline doesn't matter as much in this type of scenario. So I'll loop this. So you can see when I looped it, it actually took away the waveform display because it could be anywhere within inside of when it's looping like that and the timeline stops, then the actual display doesn't matter anymore because it could be anywhere within inside of that. So right now when I play this back, it's playing nicely. All right. So at some point, I'm going to need to loop this because I'm going to be an Explorer for a while, so I'll add a little loop region inside of here. And I was using the command key, by the way, to do it. It will basically snap to grid like this unless I hold down the command key on a Mac to do fine points like that, similar to a DAW. So now when I'm playing this, this is what it sounds like. And this new section will just loop. Now, it's basically the timeline is looping, but the file is just playing all the way through the end. So it's not looping a specific region of that section. It's actually just letting it go. Then at some point, I'm going to need a parameter to tell it when to move forward, when to move to the transition and into section 2. So that's what I'll do next is add a parameter. Next to timeline is the add parameter button. And I'll add a parameter called number of enemies. And I'm just going to go from 0 to 1 at this point. It's going to bring up that new parameter as a kind of like almost a timeline in itself, but it's not a timeline. It's actually the parameter going from 0 to 1. When I go back to the timeline, I can select my loop and then inspect the loop down here and add some parameter conditions to that. So it's going to loop as long as the value is between 0 and 0.95, like that. So when I play it, it sounds like this. It's going to keep looping this section unless my number of enemies up here gets to 1. So I'll just move that to 1 like that, like this, and then it's going to move on. And at that stop mark, I'm going to want it to fade out. So I'll just increase the length of that, and I'll fade it out like so. So now, when it's fading out, it sounds like this. Remember, my number of enemies is 1. It's going to fade out nice and slow. I'm going to fade it out a little quicker. You can grab this bar and change it to more of a linear fade. That's a little better sounding. The transition is going to play right on top of that, so I'm going to go ahead and move my transitions up so we can see how that's going to work. When my number of enemies is below 1, it's going to loop this section, and once it reaches 1, it's going to play that transition and fade out my sound. Cool. Then I need to play section 2 next, so I'll go over here and play section 2. Now I have quite a bit of overlap in my sections going from my transition into section 2. By the way, section 2 also needs to loop, so I'm going to go ahead and put it into loop mode, and then go ahead and adjust the end of that to go like that. So I want a little bit of fade up on this one too, so I'm going to go ahead and fade it like so, and see how that sounds. That's actually working kind of nicely. Okay, then I need a secondary loop, right, to stay in the combat section or the battle section for a little while. So I'll add another loop region here. Just make it short. So it's going to continue playing that section for me. And at some point, we're going to need to get out of that in the same way that we're getting out of section 1. So I'm going to go to over here to my second transition. My first, my combat state, I'm going to need to fade out underneath that. So I'll go ahead and do like a nice fade. We'll probably want it to fade a little bit like that. Okay. So last thing, I'm just going to maneuver this kind of into place a little bit so that when I'm coming out of it, it's going to play the transition and play the fade out on the combat region. All right. So let's play the whole thing together. I'm going to save, play it. We're going to start with 0 enemies. My loop comes in, it's faded. We're going to stay in this section for a while because the timeline is looping. The timeline is looping based on the number of enemies. And so when the number of enemies gets up to 1, then it's going to fade the section and go into the new battle section. It's going to play the transition. And it's going to stay in battle section until my number of enemies gets below 1. If I added the condition, which I did not, so I will go ahead and add it. I have to make sure that when this will only loop when we're above, say, 95 is good. And so we're going to loop here for a while. Okay, I'm going to need that to fade quicker. So I'm going to move this back a little bit and not use quite as long a fade time. Okay, so we're fading out, we're playing that transition. I'm going to move just a little bit closer. Oops, there we go. Okay. Now, we're going to need to go back to the beginning, and how do we do that? I'm going to add a marker for the beginning, put it here. You can pull these down to give yourself a little bit more room to see what's going on. In fact, I'll actually pull these down into the second row. There we go. Cool. So that's a little easier to see, and I have this marker A. I'm just going to call it Explore. And at the very end here, we need to go from the end to Explore. So I'll add a transition to Explore, like so. Okay. Now let's play it. We're going to notice a few things because when it goes back to Explore, it's basically going to chop this file off because it's not set to loop. I'll get to that in a second. Let's go back to the beginning and play it. Number of enemies is set to 0. I'm going to go ahead and let that loop a couple times. Then I'm going to bring up the number of enemies. The enemy enters our scene. Enemy is equal to 1. We play the transition. Now we're in the combat state. It's going to loop until the number of enemies goes below 1. Enemies is below 1. And we're back at the beginning. Okay. Now I'm going to teach you about a way to kind of get us back to the beginning. This is the most complicated part of the project. I'm going to set this to loop because if we do that, it allows us to actually put in an envelope on that piece of music. So let's check this out. So when it goes back to the beginning, and I'm going to turn off the battle section here, watch what happens. It gives us a nice little transition back into Explore. In fact, that will help us with our battle state too, which we're going to get into next. All right, so essentially this is working nicely. So when we go back to the beginning, this will fade out underneath Explore while Explore fades in, which is really great. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. This section right here, I'm going to do a similar thing with. Because it's looping, because of this button right here, we can actually add in an envelope to this one too and get rid of these transitions that we created here and just do it all within this. So I'm going to put a 3-second fade on the beginning. I'm going to put a 3-second fade at the end and actually end it a little sooner, like so. So when we listen to the end of it here, it will actually fade into the next section. Alright, it's working pretty nice. Alright, so let's listen to the whole thing together. Number of enemies is 0. We're going to be in Explore for a while. Once we need to leave Explore, the number of enemies, the way to do that is the loop is set from 0 to 0.95. As soon as it gets above 0.95, like here, it's going to continue out of the loop, play the transition, begin the next piece of music, it's going to stay in this next loop for a while until our number of enemies gets below 0.95. And we have our looping project. All right, good luck.